Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. Every 2 weeks, we discuss a different housing research paper, translating it into non-expert, non-academic language to better understand why we face the challenges we do and what can be done about them. My co-host today is Paavo Monkkonen, and our interview is with Professor Jacob Faber of NYU. This time, we're talking about the legacy of redlining, and specifically the association between the Homeowners Loan Corporation and segregation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, is responsible for creating the infamous racist redlining maps that many of us are familiar with, and which Richard Rothstein further popularized in his 2017 book, The Color of Law. Professor Faber finds that the places where HOLC created these maps saw a sharp rise in segregation between black and white households compared to places where HOLC didn't create its maps, and that effect has persisted all the way to the present day, more than 80 years after HOLC was established. That association is really interesting and really important, but it also does raise questions. HOLC was a short-lived organization, and as work by Amy Hillier and others has shown, even though it created maps based on racist assumptions, it actually lended pretty broadly to black households. Other agencies, including the massively influential Federal Housing Administration, seem to have developed their own racially discriminatory practices independent from HOLC. So why are the places mapped by HOLC still so segregated compared to the places it didn't map, even though redlining and similar discriminatory practices spread nationwide and through so many other avenues such a long time ago? We get into that debate in this conversation, and in echoes of our interview with Kathy O'Regan, we talk about some of the human consequences of this racialized geography and what responsibilities we're left with as the inheritors of federally institutionalized segregation. This is an interview that raises as many questions as it answers, but they're questions we should all be grappling with a lot more, so it's absolutely worth your time. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and you can contact me with questions or research paper ideas at shanephillips@ucla.edu or on Twitter at ShaneDPhillips. Now let's talk to Professor Faber. Joining us this week is Dr. Jacob Faber, Associate Professor at New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, with a joint appointment at the NYU Sociology Department, because we love our sociologists on this show. You're the third or fourth on here so far, I think. The paper we're discussing, published in American Sociological Review, is We Built This: Consequences of New Deal Era Intervention in America's Racial Geography. And this paper looks at how practices institutionalized in the 1930s by the federal agency, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, continue to be associated with segregated cities and neighborhoods in present-day America, almost 100 years later. So, Professor Faber, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about this.
And I feel obligated to note that we are holding this interview under protest from Mike Lenz, who...
Well, my presence is the protested part. He was mad that I got a Ferminer on without him. But or we could just say he says hi.
Yes, that too. It's not a sincere protest.
Yeah,
but he regrets that he cannot be here.
Hi, Mike.
So we'll start off how we always start off. Tell us about where you're from, where you live. If you were giving us a tour, whether it's New York City where you're at or somewhere else you consider home, what would you want to show us?
Yeah, I love this question. So I live in New York City, and I think that's where I would say I am from. I was born in the city, but grew up in northern Jersey. But I've been back in New York now for about 15 years, and I am a lover of food, and food is the thing that I am most excited to show people. New York, to be honest, has really kind of ruined my ability to enjoy travel to a lot of places just because of how good the food is here. And it's so diverse also that you can find just incredible variety in the type of food.
So where are you taking us for hand-pulled noodles?
Yeah, where are we going?
Yeah. So one of my absolute favorite restaurants is a Thai place in Queens, in Woodside, called Shripapai. And it is, it's at the top of every, best Asian food or best Thai food in New York City lists. And it is just transcendent. It does not taste like any other food that I've had before. And we went there after my kid got her first COVID shot a couple weeks ago, and it felt like it was the first time we had been there since the start of the pandemic. And he had outside, but it was still just incredible. So that's a must see or must eat, I suppose.
I'll put that on the list.
And wait, so is there a better hand-pulled noodles than Xi'an's famous? I mean, that's the...
Yeah, it's a good question. I love that place too. And there's one just a couple blocks from where we live.
And I was thinking the other thing you said would ruin travel for you, but for me, it's like then you can go to the most special place for a certain dish, and like it gives you a new appreciation, right? Because even in New York, maybe the hand-pulled noodles are not as good as they are in Xi'an.
So I don't want to bury the lead here, so I'll kick us off by sharing the major finding of your article, which is that you find that cities where the Homeowners Loan Corporation assessed and graded neighborhoods using their pretty infamous redlining maps, these neighborhoods and cities are more segregated today, almost 100 years after the agency was created, compared to similar places where HOLC did not create these maps. And we'll get into what all that means in more detail. But since the history of HOLC and these other New Deal housing market interventions is really integral to understanding these findings, I want to start there. In the introduction, you write, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, Federal Housing Administration, and GI Bill created the contemporary U.S. Homeownership Society, but largely excluded people and communities of color from affordable mortgage credit through explicit and implicit means, thereby reifying racialized neighborhood boundaries. So what problems were these programs trying to address, and how did they actually work? And I think we can probably focus on HOLC and the FHA, since these came earlier, starting in the 1930s, whereas the GI Bill came a little later, starting after World War II.
Yeah. So I think most of the time when we talk about the Great Depression, we talk about it as an employment crisis, and it certainly was, the worst employment crisis in American history, probably. But it was also a housing crisis. In 1933, about half of mortgage debt was in default. There were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who were losing their homes due to foreclosures and evictions, and really just enormous amounts of Americans who were homeless. And so these policies, especially HOLC, were designed to kind of stabilize the housing market, which was and remains a big part of the economy, and also as an employment program to kind of encourage housing construction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So HOLC was part of the 1933 Homeowners Loan Act, and the program bought distressed residential mortgages from private lenders and then refinanced them with the original borrowers on easier terms. So kind of helping people at risk of foreclosure or already in the foreclosure process to stabilize their credit obligations. And then FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, came to be as part of the National Housing Act just a year later in 1934. And this was a mortgage insurance program run by the government to replace the private mortgage guarantee industry that had collapsed with the fall of the housing market in the early 1930s. And it required mortgage lenders to offer mortgage terms with longer time periods, lower interest rates, and lower down payment requirements that were previously available on the market. And because of these changes, these requirements, owning your home or kind of holding a mortgage became much cheaper than renting in many parts of the country. And so, we really have these programs to thank for the Contemporary Homeownership Society. They are responsible for institutionalizing and making quite common the long-term fixed payment mortgage. And this financial instrument lifted tens of millions of Americans into homeownership, and this became the primary tool for wealth accumulation for most Americans.
Right. Yeah. We have it to thank or to blame.
Sure. Yes.
In some
right.
ways.
To blame. Yeah. Yeah.
So I realized I didn't really write about this in my notes, but I kind of took it for granted that people would know what redlining was, but I don't think we should assume that here. So can you just talk a little bit about what the redlining, where that concept comes from, and what role HOLC and FHA played in that?
Yeah. So now that the government is concerned about mortgage lending, they are concerned about lending risk, and so they hire appraisers to go to hundreds of cities across the country and assess the lending risk in neighborhoods within those cities. And they based those assessments on a number of different characteristics of the neighborhood, including the existing housing stock, proximity to environmental hazards or parks, as well as the characteristics of the people who lived there. So, wealth, the income of people there, the migration status, as well as race. These appraisers were obsessed with the presence of Black people. A single Black person in your neighborhood could guarantee you the lowest grade, which was a D. These grades went from A to D, with A being the highest grades and D being the lowest grades. And appraisers use these grades, to make maps of these cities. These maps were then called residential security maps. And it became harder to get mortgage credit in D neighborhoods, red neighborhoods, over the subsequent generations. And this is where the term redlining came from, because they were literally drawing red lines around poor neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, and the like.
Mm-hmm. And I had a follow-up question about, this is also off script, but I'm very curious to know about the appraisers themselves. I wonder if you, in your research, looked into that at all. There's been a lot of good work, historical work on realtors, like the, Paige Glotzer's book and Laura Redford. And I wonder probably in some cases they were the same people, or were the appraisers kind of coming from DC to these cities, or were they already kind of people active locally in the real estate market?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we have some historical record of the business of appraising for HOLC and for FHA, but a lot of the pieces are missing. We know that appraisers coordinated with local real estate concerns to assess risk, but we also know that appraisers received extensive training from HOLC and were supposed to be able to just be dropped in any city and successfully able to appraise neighborhoods within that city. Of course, that's not how anything works. And I'm sure there was quite a bit of variation in the stringency of neighborhood appraisals across appraisers. But, I think that this is still a question to be answered.
Maybe we should walk through a little bit how this redlining actually could cause segregation, and then we can talk about what the consequences of that segregation would be. So we have these red line districts, these D grades and these C grades. How is that actually preventing, Black households from moving into white neighborhoods, discouraging white households from moving into Black neighborhoods, and so on?
So, the top line impact was that it became harder to be a homeowner in redlined areas, especially if you're a person of color, but also for white people. It became easier to be a homeowner in neighborhoods that got the best grades, the green grades. And so this kind of pulled people in kind of both directions to segregate neighborhoods and cities and towns.
And you've done a lot of work on the consequences of racial discrimination and segregation in the housing market, including how communities and households are, ultimately impacted by it. Could you give us just a quick primer on some of those consequences? Like, what do our neighborhoods look like today, at least, in part because of these government interventions? And how have people been actually harmed? And how do they continue to be harmed by the racial geography that you describe in this paper?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I mean, these programs were a long time ago, and there's been a lot of change since then, and quite a bit of variation in the trajectories of neighborhoods. But on average, the places that were redlined almost a century ago are still marked by disadvantage today. So they tend to be places of higher levels of racial isolation, higher poverty, lower home values and home ownership rate, lower rates of intergenerational economic mobility. Contemporary mortgage credit is harder to get in historically redlined places, and it's more expensive when it is given. And there's even some research, not done by me, but connecting the legacy of redlining to vulnerability to climate change, that historically redlined neighborhoods are much hotter than neighborhoods that got better grades.
Yeah, we'll have to link to that paper in our show notes. Another line from your paper that stood out to me is this. New Deal housing programs certainly did not invent segregationist mortgage provision, but they institutionalized the practice and implemented it at an unprecedented scale. This is a point that Richard Rothstein also drives home in his book, The Color of Law. And in that book, he also quotes Sherilyn Ifill, who says something to the effect of, as a society, we enjoy privileges and freedoms that we did not earn, that were secured by our predecessors and ancestors. And that means we also carry responsibility for the harms that were imposed or not addressed by our predecessors and ancestors. I'm curious if you have any of your own reflections on what it means for us to have institutionalized these practices through government programs and policy, and what kinds of obligations that might impose on us that a less institutionalized system might not.
Yeah, we too often equate responsibility with blame, which makes people defensive, especially in our conversations around race and the history of race.
Yeah.
But let's say I stole $1,000 from you and gave it to my kid, who took that $1,000 and invested it in a mutual fund. 50 years later, that $1,000 has appreciated quite a bit, and my child has more wealth than your child, assuming you have a kid in this example, of course. And, let's go another generation forward. Let's say my child used the wealth they accumulated to invest in their kids' education, their kids' entrepreneurship and homeownership. How should we be thinking about the difference in success between my grandkid who benefited from my theft and your grandkid? What if we go another generation forward? How much has that initial $1,000 grown, not just in the form of financial capital, but also human capital, like education, investments in health, etc.? I think most people would agree that my descendants should compensate yours in some fashion in this example. And this example is just within, my family and your family. What happens when a government enacts a policy that has intergenerational consequences for inequalities? What if the federal government took that $1,000 from you and gave it to me? And, there are plenty of government decisions that were made well before I was born, and well before most of your listeners were probably born, that we are still paying for today. The Korean and Vietnam Wars were fought decades before I was born, but my tax dollars still support the pensions of people who fought in those wars. So to me, there's a moral responsibility to right the wrongs of the past. And this research that really exploded, documenting the long-term consequences of this federal redlining, and it really underscores the importance of reparations.
Yeah.
And, there is also a kind of powerful cultural impact of these policies, which is even harder to measure. These policies, through the appraisal process, conflated race with lending risk and property value, thereby linking whiteness to wealth accumulation through this really powerful market mechanism that encouraged segregation. And I don't even know how we go about measuring the impact of these policies on racial animus, these policies that legitimated and institutionalize racism, wreaking havoc on virtually all aspects of American life.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, and these are the things that it's much, much harder to measure, right? Is kind of how this conflation between race and property values like plays out in so many different ways in society.
And I think that point about, imagine this one generation forward, 2, 3, 4, not only does it illustrate just how big the effects can be, but as you go forward in time and the space between when things started and where we are today grows, teasing out like who's benefited, who's been harmed, how you shift resources just gets more and more difficult as well. And I think we're in that place now for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
But let's talk about some things we can measure, I guess. So I would compliment this paper, especially. I'm teaching a class on zoning for equity that has a lot of history in it. And so I thought this paper was really useful for that class to connect kind of 100 years of history. And I compliment the painstaking data work that went into doing this research. So, the basic idea is looking at places that were appraised by HOLC and places that weren't, and kind of how did that affect their segregation trajectories and levels of segregation today. So can you maybe talk about how you came up with that idea and how you went about making it happen?
Yeah, so, ideally, I would have used longitudinal data sets with the same measures of race and the same measures of municipal boundaries and neighborhood boundaries from before HOLC was implemented all the way through today. And unfortunately, those data don't exist. So I pulled together data from almost a century's worth of decennial censuses and measured segregation on the city level for, as you said, places that were appraised and places that were not, and kind of compared the trends over time. And many of your listeners might be thinking, okay, well, there maybe was something inherently different about places that were appraised compared to places that weren't. And there were differences, and appraisal was not random. The federal guidelines requested residential security maps for cities with at least 40,000 residents, but there was quite imperfect implementation of that guideline. We have maps, for example, of entire counties that include a number of towns and cities. We have maps that were drawn for sections of metropolitan areas that include, again, multiple cities. And so there are a lot of cities that overlap with these residential security maps, the redlining maps, that had populations below 40,000. And there are also a number of cities that that we don't have maps for that were above 40,000. So what I also do as a robustness check is to compare the impact of HOLC over time within a number of subsamples of cities and towns that were around this 40,000 cutoff, and if just below it and just above it, which again includes a mix of small cities that were appraised and large cities that weren't. Mm-hmm. And, admittedly, this rests on a non-trivial assumption, which is that all cities near the cutoff were at risk of being appraised, which is admittedly a large assumption. But I think that the results are pretty compelling and consistent. So I believe them.
Yeah, no, and even if they're thinking about the reasons that one city would have been appraised while a similar city wouldn't have been appraised, I think no matter what those reasons are, the differences 100 years later are pretty striking, right?
Right.
But and so on that, I wonder what you think about kind of why some cities that were bigger weren't appraised. And I mean, I understand more why some smaller cities were, if they're kind of caught in a county or in a metro area that had a larger kind of appraisal catchment area, but kind of these larger cities that weren't appraised, or, the role of local actors in seeking appraisal? Because that was kind of the first thing I was thinking of is, if you have these segregatory places asking for this redlining maps to be drawn, maybe that could be one explanation.
Yeah, we know, thanks to work by historian Nathan Connolly, that there were instances where local real estate concerns tried to manipulate the appraisals for the purpose of real estate speculation. So, if you were a real estate investor and you could convince the HOLC appraiser to give a neighborhood a lower grade, that would make accessing these federal programs more difficult, which would increase foreclosures and therefore reduce property prices, making it less expensive for you to buy land in those places. But to circle back to your question, we really don't know. This could just be a complete accident of history. It's possible my data have errors in them. But for example, we don't have a map for Washington, D.C., which was definitely bigger than 40,000 people in 1930. But we don't have a map. And because of the secrecy that HOLC and later FHA kind of exhibit around their practices, which we can talk about later, it's possible that there was a map made for DC and it was just lost to history and we just don't have it anymore.
Wow.
So it's possible that there are a number of cities in my data set that I have coded as not graded that in fact were. And, whether or not the historical data exists to figure that out is an open question. Maybe they're sitting, maybe these maps are sitting at the bottom of a dusty box in some basement somewhere, and we just don't know.
Right. Or the archival retention strategy was to destroy them at some point in time.
Yeah.
Which would be very unfortunate. Can you give me a sense of in 1930 there were 5,000 municipalities, incorporated cities in the country, and how many? I don't know if that's true. I'm just guessing. And how many did you have maps, and kind of how many are in your study sample?
Yeah, so there were about kind of 200 cities that were mapped, that we have maps for, or that kind of overlap with maps.
Right.
And the number of cities in my sample varies a little bit from year to year based on census data availability. Census data was good in the early 1900s because we have access to the complete count, on the individual level. And then the data get bad in 1950 and 60, and then they get better again in 1970, 80, 90, and 2010. And so I have, a lot of cities in the sample, several hundred, and then fewer, and then many more.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, so I guess moving on to the kind of outcome of interest in your paper, which is the kind of level of segregation. I've used three different. I'm a big information theory index proponent, but I like also using multiple indicators for a phenomenon. So maybe talk about the pros and cons of the three different indexes you use and why you chose to use three.
Yeah, so I used these three different measures, which are among the most commonly used measures of segregation. The isolation index, which measures the typical neighborhood percent Black for a Black resident within a city. The dissimilarity index, which measures the percent of either Blacks or whites that would have to change neighborhoods, have to move for there to be an even distribution of that group within a city. And then the information theory index, which measures unevenness by comparing the diversity of neighborhoods, in my case, tracts within a city to the overall diversity of that city. And, ideally in social science, you'd like to have a number of different ways of measuring the outcome you care about, because every measurement has limitations, and these measures of segregation have a number of limitations, like they're somewhat sensitive to the racial makeup of places, as well as the choice of geographic unit. And perhaps most importantly, none of these measures are spatial. They're all kind of aspatial measures of segregation. So they, thankfully for me professionally, all the results all point in the same direction, and there are no real differences across any of these measures.
And maybe before we get to the results, I'm curious how you think about kind of what I see as kind of a challenging, complicating factor, which is the role of municipal boundaries in metropolitan level segregation, and kind of the choice you made to measure segregation within a municipality rather than kind of metro areas where more of the places were HOLC mapped compared to other metro areas where fewer of the places were HOLC mapped.
Yeah, this is a really excellent question, and something that I continue to struggle with kind of empirically and theoretically as well. A lot of the segregation literature analyzes metropolitan areas, so like a city and its suburbs, because those geographic units are usually drawn to capture like an entire employment market or a housing market. And when we think about the way that the kind of form that segregation typically took in the middle to end of the 20th century was a very stark like city suburb split. And so if you measure segregation on the metropolitan area level, you will get higher estimates of segregation than I did when I measured on the city level or the place level, where and places and cities tend to be more homogeneous than metropolitan areas, which is why their levels of segregation tend to be lower. And again, I kind of really struggled with trying to figure out what was the right geography for measuring this, because again of this city suburb dynamic, especially I think moving past HOLC and into the Federal Housing Administration, which was really ramped up suburbanization. I feel like my paper really misses that whole story. But the choice, I was really kind of forced into this choice because of identification strategy. Trying to identify a causal effect on the metropolitan level felt like was much more difficult given the nature of HOLC maps. I'm trying to challenge that assumption of mine a bit in more recent work, but I think I would love to figure out a way to understand the kind of total effect that these policies had on segregation, which again my estimates probably understate.
All right. So we shared the very high level findings at the very beginning, but I do want to get into those at more detail now. So, it's one thing to find that the cities that were appraised or mapped by HOLC are more segregated than unappraised cities. But really, the scale of the difference between these two groups and the statistical significance is really impressive. And, you were kind of humble in saying maybe the data is just not there. The maps are hidden away somewhere. But I do think just based on the statistical significance here, the amount of maps that would have to turn up that have the opposite results of the ones you've already looked at, it would have to be very large to kind of overturn your findings here. So for each of these measures of segregation that you looked at, what were the results here?
So just to use the numbers in the paper, the average white-black dissimilarity, isolation, and information theory indices were 12, 16, and 8 points higher, respectively, in places that were appraised compared to places that weren't, again, on average across all of the post-HOLC years. And, these numbers don't really mean, they don't mean anything in the abstract, but they are in the world of segregation scholarship really quite large differences. The isolation gap indicates that compared to Black residents of ungraded cities. Black people in graded cities live in neighborhoods with a 12% higher, 16% higher Black population share on average, which is a pretty big difference.
Mm-hmm. And that's percent, not percentage point, right?
Yes, percent. Yes.
Okay.
Right. And, in terms of the dissimilarity in information theory indices, another way of thinking about the magnitude of these effects, cities. So segregation along these two indices has been declining since since 1960 or 70. And cities that were appraised remain effectively 2 decades behind cities that were not appraised on both of these indices. So that's a lot of difference.
What do you think the mechanism or mechanisms are by which these appraisals are contributing to this increased segregation? And not just, this sort of almost immediate increase in the 40s and 50s, but then this persistent increase that has lasted in many cases to the present day. The association between these things, between the appraisal and the segregation is very clear, and the magnitude of the difference and the statistical significance speak for themselves. But what's the story for how HOLC's involvement may have actually caused or contributed to this increased segregation? And I'll kind of combine a few questions here, because I think what both Pavo and I have in mind here is some other papers that have come out over the past 20 years, really, starting or at least including Amy Hillier's paper looking at Philadelphia and HOLC there, and more recently work by Fishback, Snowden, Rose, and Storrs, which found that HOLC itself actually loaned pretty broadly in Black neighborhoods. So how does that all fit in together? What's the mechanism? Just curious to hear your reflections on this big picture.
Right. First, there is a ton more work needed here, especially on the relationship between these HOLC maps and HOLC's inheritors, like the FHA and the GI Bill. And so in some way, it's, I could kind of easily, I kind of do this in the paper, kind of hand wave the mechanisms. But, there are likely, or were likely, a wide range of mechanisms, including kind of limiting access to neighborhoods and towns for primarily people of color. So kind of forcing people to live separately. Also penalizing whites who lived in mixed race neighborhoods with lower grades. And then you can think about the second order consequences of this limited access to home ownership and its implications for racially differentiated wealth accumulation. So, if you can't buy a home or can't buy a home cheaply, then you were unable to accumulate wealth and then pass it on to your children and to later generations. And, that wealth kind of accrues over time. And now we have an incredibly large wealth gap that limits people's mobility and where they can live even more. And there's also these kind of self-reinforcing consequences of segregation, like the segregation of information and kind of what neighborhoods people even know about. But it's I'm really happy that there is a rapidly growing body of work in this field. And I've been in conversation with Thomas Storrs about the the kind of differences in our findings, and hopefully we'll have an answer for you in maybe a year from now. But it seems incredibly clear that HOLC maps did something. My work is a small part of this growing body of research that shows really profound impacts of these maps. But at the same time, the specific mechanisms which social scientists really kind of stress over are kind of unclear. I'm working with a team of graduate students here at NYU, Riley Sando and Kate Thomas, to find more data on lending specifically. But I'm also really interested in how HOLC fits into other historical processes. We've had massive social and economic and cultural and geographic changes since these maps were made in the late 1930s, including, of course, the banning of housing discrimination and redlining, lightly enforced, of course. But, one of the things that I really strongly believe, and this is not an original thought, is that HOLC helped set up subsequent processes, or kind of set them in motion, or kind of helped direct them in discriminatory ways. So, for example, maybe mid-century zoning policies were implemented differently in places that had maps and in places that didn't. It's possible that these maps and the effects that I'm finding, that the effects are less about housing than it is about something else, like schools, maybe, or congressional districts, or commercial development. So this really kind of excites me. There's so much more work that needs to be done, and I'm really happy to be part of this conversation.
Got your career laid out for you.
That is exciting. I'm curious. I mean, back to this, like the idea of selection bias in terms of which places get mapped and which places don't. I wonder if there would be other ways, or whether you've thought about how to kind of get at that question, just looking at, other kinds of data on racial animosity, or kind of like how racist local leaders were in different cities at the time, and kind of trying to correlate that with getting mapped or not.
Yeah, no, there's, so I have been trying to think about this, and I know that there are many other people who are in more advanced stages of this, which I'm happy about, is understanding, and this is related to your question earlier, kind of variation in appraisers' decision making. So, for example, if you could estimate a measure of the racial animus of appraisers on the city level, that measure is likely to be predictive of future outcomes.
Right.
And, that could really give, provide a lot of insight into this mechanism question. It's possible that there are archival records, correspondence between appraisers, or between HOLC and local real estate concerns that we don't know about. And I think it's possible, just to kind of pinpoint the critique of all this work. I think it's possible that there were plenty of vectors of discrimination that were well in place and well underway before HOLC.
Right.
But the counterfactual is that billions of dollars of federal investment in segregation and reorganizing an entire financial market had no impact. And I find that just like impossible to believe. And I also tried really hard to make the findings go away, and and couldn't. So
no, there's clearly good social science there. What people have said, like, so is my history of this correct, that like no one had written about HOLC maps until Ken Jackson found them in a basement somewhere, and kind of like going to this like did people see these at the time, and how prevalent was their kind of visibility? I wonder if you know more about that. I assume you know more about that than I do.
I know maybe a little bit more, and I'm still in the process of learning, because I'm going through some of the archival data myself. That's the data that's available online, and this is the way we do research during the pandemic. But my understanding of the history, and this is I found this again in the archival records, as well as in like newspaper and magazine reporting of the time, that there was quite a bit of concern among civil rights groups that these programs were discriminatory. And so, people knew at the time what they were doing. The FHA was sued, and it's likely that the fact that we don't have any FHA maps today is because they destroyed evidence during a discrimination lawsuit.
Before they could get PRA'd.
Right. We have one map left of Chicago.
Yeah.
That's the only one. And lending records also don't seem to exist anymore, which also seems hard to believe that they never did. But I think that Ken Jackson is probably the first published social scientist to to write about the impact of these maps. But certainly people at the time were organizing around them.
Good reminder that academics and researchers are not always the most on top of these things in the moment.
I think it's not surprising that the white academy ignored this for the middle of the whole middle of the 20th century, right?
Right.
Okay, so you go to great lengths here to show this association between HOLC appraisals and racial segregation, and do so really effectively. And you've been, again, very humble about kind of the limitations and how much more there is to learn here. But I'm curious to hear kind of some of for things you haven't addressed already, what are some of the criticisms you've received? And if you're trying to kind of steel man your own position here, or at least, even if you're not fully standing behind like everything in this paper is definitely true no matter what, if you are trying to make that case, what are some of the criticisms you've heard and how do you respond to those?
Yeah, so I think that there are two broad criticisms that overlap quite a bit. The first is the indigeneity concern, that there is something inherently different about cities that were appraised and cities that weren't. That is the reason that they became more segregated over time. And I kind of hope that my taking advantage of this imperfect implementation of the mapping guidelines allays some of that concern. And the other, again, kind of largely overlapping critique is that these policies didn't do anything new. That banks were redlining before that term was invented. There was plenty of mortgage discrimination that existed beforehand, and that's certainly true. But it seems quite clear. I'm not the only person who's saying this now, that these maps had a causal effect, and again, the counterfactuals that these huge programs that created the American Homeownership Society and explicitly discriminated against people of color had no effect on racial inequality, and that doesn't make any sense.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference you observe between impacts in the South and the rest of the country?
Yeah, so I find a much stronger effect among cities in the South than in the rest of the country. The effect is statistically significant for what that's worth, but it's I think that it's I feel less confident about it than I do about the overall effects. I mean, the historical narrative of it makes sense. There was more explicit resistance to civil rights and anti-housing discrimination efforts in the South than there was in the North, but there was plenty of that in the North as well. And so I once we kind of get into this kind of regional differences piece, I become a little bit more concerned about the indigeneity. But the effect is there, and it's quite big. The impact in the South was like twice the size of the impact in the rest of the country, which is quite big.
So near the end of the paper, you consider some counterfactuals, one of which assumed that HOLC had just never existed, and the other assumed sort of the opposite, that we adopted a anti-racist, integrationist housing policy agenda instead of the discriminatory segregationist policies we actually had. And, I realize anytime I start asking on this podcast about forecasts, projections, speculation, all researchers are hesitant to do this.
Yeah.
But it's in your paper, so I feel like it's fair game. What would you want to have seen from that anti-racist counterfactual? I think we can take it as a given that FHA would not have engaged in redlining and the promotion of racial covenants as they did, that the GI Bill would have been available to veterans of all races and ethnicities. But what else would you be looking for out of this?
So, full disclosure, this section of the paper was not in the original draft, and I added it on the insistence of one of the anonymous reviewers. And I'm really glad that I did, because it's the part of the paper that I get the most questions about from journalists, especially, because it kind of is quite straightforward, and it's something that I plan on incorporating into future papers as well. Because
you don't get a lot of questions about research design on the from the
no,
journalists.
not always, but I just a quick complaint tangent about academic publishing. We are so often told to be so conservative and narrow with our conclusions, which oftentimes makes the research kind of contextless. I do this research because I care about policy. So, if I'm not able to say something about policy and what good policy could have looked like, or the impact that good policy could have had, then I feel like the work that I do isn't as useful.
Mm-hmm.
But to your question, there are many things that a policy could have done to advance an anti-racist agenda. It could have encouraged financing of affordable housing in wealthier neighborhoods, for example, through rewarding rather than penalizing neighborhoods that had both single-family and multifamily homes. It similarly could have rewarded neighborhoods for being integrated rather than referring to it as it was referred to on in the appraiser's documents as infiltration.
Mm-hmm.
They could have specifically encouraged lending on affordable terms to African Americans. And interestingly, so I've been reading through the Federal Housing Administration's archives recently, and at the start of these archives, which is the first ones in 1935, these annual reports, they are strongly encouraging restrictive covenants and exclusionary zoning, and then they stop doing that once the Supreme Court said that restrictive covenants were illegal in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, and then after that decision, all of the FHA annual reports start claiming that they care about minority homeownership and that they're encouraging minority homeownership with no data. Of course, they have no data to back up those claims. But anyway, these policies, FHA and HOLC, could have fought discrimination in lending through hiring Black employees or audits or data collection. We have the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act now that requires lenders to provide data on mortgage applications, and could have implemented something like that. But, again, going back to something that we talked about earlier, the original sin of all of this, to borrow a famous phrase, is the conflation of race with capital accumulation. And
right.
I think a lot of this damage would have been avoided if HOLC simply didn't do that.
I mentioned if you want it, you've got a lifetime's worth of research to do on all of this. And I know that this paper, even that we're talking about, is not even your most recent one on the subject. So just curious if you could kind of talk a little bit about, your paper with Daniel Aronson, Daniel Hartley, Bhaskar Mazumdar, and Patrick Sharkey that compared socioeconomic outcomes for people living in HOLC and non-HOLC cities. So not just how segregated are they, but actually, how are people's lives going in these places? What'd you find there, and what does the future hold for your research?
Yeah, so that group of economists, Dan Aronson Hartley and Bash Mazumdar, wrote a really good paper on the neighborhood level impacts of redlining on racial segregation and home values and credit scores, et cetera. And so Pat Sharkey, who's a collaborator of mine, and I kind of reached out to them to see if there were kind of other outcomes that were worth looking at. And so we kind of applied the method that they innovated in their paper. looking at kind of buffers around neighborhood grade boundaries. So like boundaries between C graded neighborhoods and B graded neighborhoods, and then C and D neighborhoods. And we looked at a large range of outcomes, including the likelihood of upward mobility across generations, incarceration, poverty, having a single parent, or having a kid as a teenager, et cetera. And we found a pretty consistent pattern across all of these outcomes that the likelihood of having a positive outcome was significantly lower in redlined neighborhoods.
I like this kind of paper just as a complement because it sort of illustrates what, the Kerner Commission report 50 years ago stated, that the segregation is not this harmless thing. There are actual negative consequences for people's lives beyond the isolation itself. So I think that's a really important follow-up. Anything else you want to add before we let you go?
Yeah, so I think that this work makes two broad arguments. The first is the importance or centrality of public policy in shaping opportunity. Right, these policies made homeownership possible by making it cheaper for tens of millions of Americans, and homeownership skyrocketed from the low 40% to the mid 60% because of these policies. And flowing from that is a real importance of acknowledging the intentionality behind these programs. This is where the "we built this" part of the title of this paper comes from. That the racial inequalities that we see today, whether that's segregation or incarceration or mobility, this was all intentionally constructed through public policy. And I think that this sheds light on the kind of the scope of the problem and the bearer of responsibility, which is a kind of collective responsibility, and therefore a real moral need for a remedy.
Professor Jacob Faber, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your service. I know these data-intensive projects are unrecognized in terms of how much painful work go into it. So I think it's extremely. The research community is grateful to you, and, highlighting these things that people.
We're here to recognize.
Thank you.
You can read more about Professor Faber's research and find our show notes and a transcript of the interview at our website, lewis.ucla.edu. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and tell your friends and colleagues where to find us. We release a new episode every 2 weeks. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips. You can find Pavo there at El Pavo. Thanks again for listening to the UCLA Housing Voice podcast. See you next time.